Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to the fourth in the series on the future of American power and influence. Before we get started, I want to squelch a rumor. Several people have asked me, what are these cameras doing here, this one and that one? And I am here to categorically deny the story that Mr. Trump is going to come here in a few minutes to warm up for the Fox debate tomorrow night. Lisa King will not permit him to do that. The cameras are here because C-SPAN is taping this session, and it's going to be broadcast in the near future. And when the date is set, you can find out from the website of the OSHER Society. A couple of housekeeping items first. Please turn in your question cards at the break. We'll have extra ones here. If anyone has any difficulty hearing the speakers, please wave in the back and we'll try to do something about that. We're very grateful for our major sponsors. They are on the screen, as you will see. Kendall, Ledyard Bank, and today is the 20th anniversary of the founding of Caldwell Law, so we're mostly grateful for them. And Wells Fargo is also a sponsor. But there's another group of people that we've sort of overlooked, and I want to express our gratitude to them this morning. There's been a tradition here that on the Tuesday before the Wednesday, our members open their homes for dinners, informal dinners for the speakers. And that's been going on for some time since David Bisno started this program many years ago. And the people who have generously provided that kind of hospitality are Mike and Margaret Galbraith, Stephanie Reininger and Joe Medlicott, last night Dennis and Barbara Stern, and coming up George Haino and Diane Crowley. Thank you very much for your help on that. I have to admit that this is a special treat for me today because in addition to being a news junkie, I am a former newspaper reporter and I truly value great journalism. And this age of disruptive digital communication, it's gratifying to know that we still have some fascinating, fabulous newspapers like the Washington Post, the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Valley News, among others. And so I am honored to introduce our first speaker. Marty Barron grew up in Miami, and graduating from Lehigh, since then he's been a newspaper man. He's worked at the Miami Herald, the Los Angeles Times, the New York Times, the Boston Globe, and since 2012, he's been executive editor of the Washington Post. As editor of some of these newspapers, particularly the Miami Herald and the Boston Globe and the Washington Post, his team at these newspapers have won, by my count, 10 Pulitzer Prizes for excellence in journalism. And the most recent one at the Washington Post was earlier this year when he and his team won the Pulitzer for the series on the Secret Service lapses in protecting the President of the United States, a great series of stories. Marty is a fine journalist. He is also has a keen interest in art museums, collects art, and altogether, I'm very proud to be able to present one of the best newspaper editors in the nation, Marty Barron.
Thank you very much, Tom, for that very kind introduction. And I'm delighted to be able to speak with you all here today. I'm especially pleased to be able to share the stage today with Elisabeth Bumiller, We started our careers together in the late 1970s at the Miami Herald as reporters there. So it's wonderful to be with her here today. The subject that I want to discuss today is a subject that's close to my heart, critical to my profession, and I believe vital for democracy, human dignity, and personal liberty. The subject is freedom of expression. You know, the case for freedom of expression was made long ago, and among the most eloquent proponents was John Milton, and his ideas helped set the course for our own principles today. In 1644, Milton wrote this: "Give me the liberty to know, to utter, and to argue freely according to conscience, above all liberties." Today, in much of the world, that liberty is either non-existent or in jeopardy. And let me start by telling you about two recent encounters of mine. In January of last year, I spoke with a leading figure in the governance of the internet. We talked about surveillance by the National Security Agency and how the agency had tapped so voraciously into international data networks. This was a subject that we had covered intensively at the Washington Post, and for which we, along with The Guardian and Great Britain, had won a Pulitzer Prize in 2014. I was interested in what this internet official was hearing as he traveled the world in the aftermath of disclosures that originated with Edward Snowden. Snowden's massive leak of highly classified documents had revealed some of this nation's most sensitive national security secrets. Much of the worldwide reaction until that point had fallen into the category of outrage. Rights activists and government officials had decried the US government's aggressive intrusion into the privacy of citizens of other countries. Foreign governments protested that even the privacy of presidents and prime ministers in countries that were our allies had been breached. The NSA had listened in on their phone conversations. But as this internet official traveled Asia, outrage was not what he heard. What did he hear? Jealousy. Leaders told him, "We have excellent computer scientists. Why haven't we been able to do this?" And they aspired to monitor their own citizens as skillfully as the US government had. So that's story number one, and now story number two. Early this summer, I was visited in Washington by the owners, editors, and legal counsel of El Universo, a leading newspaper in Ecuador. They sought to bring attention to the ways in which the government of Ecuador was strangling the press, dictating what it prints, threatening crippling fines, pressuring media outlets in hopes they would become docile, deferential, compliant. This June, El Universo was fined $350,000 by the government on the grounds that it failed to satisfy all requirements for publishing a response by the government to one of its stories. A 2-year-old communications law provides that individuals who feel their dignity or honor has been damaged by a media report have the right to respond. In this case, El Universo had published a story about Ecuador's healthcare system under the headline, "$1.7 billion in federal debt impairs healthcare system." The paper had sought to interview healthcare system officials prior to publication, even sending a list of questions. The request went unanswered. When the story was published, it was sharply criticized by Ecuador's president, Rafael Correa. He even questioned the statistics that, as it turns out, came directly from the healthcare system itself. And then Correa's Secretariat of Communications ordered El Universo to publish a rebuttal, which it did. But the rebuttal did not carry a summary, also written by the Secretariat of Communications, and it did not carry a headline crafted by the Secretariat that accompanied its rebuttal. The Secretariat ordered its summary published, and it ordered its headline published, and El Universo then complied. So the headline then read, The healthcare system has made progress and will improve even more in the coming years. On top of that, the newspaper now had to pay a fine for alleged noncompliance with the law regarding rebuttals, a fine equivalent to 10% of its average revenue in the previous quarter. So the fine totaled $350,000. With each recurrence of a particular offense, a fine is doubled. It can continue doubling without limit. The fines and pressure are having what seems to be the intended effect. In 2014, 4 media outlets closed, largely as a result of this so-called organic communications law. In short, in Ecuador, the press will either buckle to the government or the government will break it. El Universo calls these legal maneuvers creeping expropriation, and rightly so. The 2 stories I've told show something about free expression. It can be threatened from many directions, and that is what is happening. Not long ago, the world hoped for better. We seem to be entering a new era of free expression brought about by the internet, social media, and smartphones. Some concluded that citizen communications would flourish in a way previously unimagined, and that governments, even the most autocratic, would be denied the tight control that kept them in power. This idea took firm root during the Arab Spring, which began at the tail end of 2010 with the Tunisian Revolution, and then spread through the Arab world. With protests in Egypt against the regime of Hosni Mubarak, the world marveled at the impact of social media, how it could be used to organize and to facilitate free expression, how it might overcome repression. It was a hopeful time for those who believed in the liberating power of technology over the traditional, too often tyrannical powers of government. Truth moves faster than lies and propaganda becomes flammable, wrote BBC commentator Paul Mason in 2011. He said, not only is the network more powerful than the hierarchy, but the ad hoc network has become easier to form. In a book entitled Democracy's Fourth Wave, Digital Media and the Arab Spring, Philip Howard, a professor at the University of Washington, and Muzammil Hussain, a doctoral student, noted, social media alone did not cause upheaval in North Africa, but information technologies, including mobile phones and the internet, altered the capacity of citizens and civil society actors to affect domestic politics. To be fair, hopefulness came with caution. The authors of those commentaries recognized that the technology also gave governments the opportunity to monitor citizens and ultimately extinguish their voices and their movements. Professor Howard noted in one interview that authoritarian regimes have come to value digital media too. Security services in Bahrain, Iran, Saudi Arabia, and Syria observed how democracy advocates were using social media in Egypt and Tunisia and developed counterinsurgency strategies that allowed for them to surveil, mislead, and entrap protesters. Now, just the other week in the Washington Post, we published a series on threats to press freedom and journalists worldwide. Reporters documented how the security establishments of the Arab world now exploit sophisticated surveillance technology to suppress dissent. As we wrote, Egypt is implementing a social network security hazard monitoring project that allows for keyword searching and trend analysis of Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, LinkedIn, Google, Viper, WhatsApp, and other sites. At any time, a minimum of 30 analysts will monitor huge streams of data in both classical and colloquial Arabic, according to a 2014 Interior Ministry request for proposals leaked to the Egyptian media. The question now is this, and it is a big one. Who will prevail in a competition that is each side deploying technology as tool and weapon? Will it be ordinary citizens and activists who aim to circumvent, undermine, and outwit autocratic governments? Or will it be the governments which possess the capacity to monitor communications as never before? In their outstanding book, the new digital age, Google's Eric Schmidt and Jared Cohen leaned toward optimism. Authoritarian governments, they wrote, will find their newly connected populations more difficult to control, repress, and influence, while democratic states will be forced to include many more voices, individuals, organizations, and companies in their affairs. And yet, they noted how authoritarian governments will have powerful weapons of their own, derived, as they wrote, from their position as gatekeeper in a world of connectivity. States, they wrote, have an enormous amount of power over the mechanics of the internet in their own countries, because states have power over the physical infrastructure connectivity requires, the transmission towers, the routers, the switches. They control the entry, exit, and waypoints for internet data. They can limit content, control what hardware people are allowed to use, and even create separate internets. Regimes may compromise devices before they are ever sold, Schmidt and Cohen pointed out. And individuals who use encryption software to avoid censorship or surveillance, or simply to protect their most private information, will become objects of suspicion. Authoritarian governments can apply enormous pressure. Schmidt and Cohen noted, states will be able to set up random checkpoints or raids to search people's devices for encryption and proxy software, the presence of which could earn them fines, jail time, or a spot on a government database of offenders. Everyone who is known to have downloaded a circumvention measure will suddenly find life more difficult. And they raise the prospect that countries will create their own domain name system. No government has yet achieved an alternative system, they write, but if a government succeeded in doing so, it would effectively unplug its population from the global internet and instead offer only a closed national intranet. China, which by the way jails more journalists than any other country, already blocks and filters information and sites with gusto. Turkey has blocked thousands of sites, and its prime minister once ordered Twitter shut down. YouTube has been blocked in Pakistan, and the government there has demanded many hundreds of times that Facebook remove content. At Google Ideas, a company unit that exists to support free expression, government attempts to censor the internet are seen as falling into basically three categories. One, what they call server-side censorship. This often consists of so-called distributed denial of service attacks to knock inconvenient voices offline. Number two, called censorship on the wire. This primarily consists of national firewalls that block access to undesirable foreign content. This can also include states leveraging their control of domain name systems, servers, and internet service providers to try to hide content. And relatively few countries are doing this right now. And third, client-side censorship. This increasingly includes what's called phishing and malware attacks to monitor independent journalists and activists. This is becoming a very popular technique for national governments. At the core of the battle over the internet is a philosophical and legal dispute over who has dominion over the internet, and thus who should govern it and how. Earlier this year, a visiting law professor at UCLA, Kristen Eichenseer, laid out the issue in the Georgetown Law Journal. Two competing visions of cyberspace have emerged so far, she wrote. Russia and China advocate a sovereignty-based model of cyber governance that prioritizes state control, while the United States, United Kingdom, and their allies argue that cyberspace should be governed by states alone. In the early days of the internet, its creators should not be governed by states alone, I should say. In the early days of the internet, its creators, advocates, protectors, and many of its users argued with no small measure of bravado that the internet had superseded governments. The internet belonged only to its users, they insisted, and governments had no role. In 1996, John Perry Barlow, co-founder of the Electronic Freedom Foundation, issued a so-called Declaration of the Independence of Cyberspace. Governments of the industrial world, he proclaimed, you weary giants of flesh and steel, I come from cyberspace, the new home of mind, and on behalf of the future, I ask you of the past to leave us alone. You are not welcome among us. You have no sovereignty where we gather. The vision collided with some inconvenient physical facts. And this was noted by some legal academics, Jack Goldsmith and Timothy Wu, including in their book, Who Controls the Internet? Illusions of a Borderless World. They took on the notion of the internet as a place of its own. The internet, after all, relies on some fairly mundane things. Underneath it all, they wrote, is an ugly physical transport infrastructure, copper wires, fiber optic cables, and the specialized routers and switches that direct information from place to place. The fact is, governments do regulate the internet, and we're now faced with the question of how far they will go in asserting control. Should the internet be regarded like other domains that fall outside national boundaries? The high seas, outer space, and Antarctica? In other words, should the internet be regarded as a global commons, subject to internationally agreed upon norms? Or instead, should it be viewed like every nation's own airspace? That would put the internet under each nation's individual, total control. In the absence of consensus, some countries are not waiting for one. Russia and China are the leaders in treating the internet more as an intranet, an internal system that is theirs to rule. That is emblematic of what has become of free expression in those countries. If there was once the spark of freedom, and there was at least that, it is now being snuffed out. Today, most Russians get their information from state-controlled broadcasters, disseminating propaganda, conspiracy, jingoism in ways big and small. One example. After the shoot-down of the Malaysian airliner in Ukraine, intelligence pointed to rebel troops as the source of the missile that took the lives of 298 people. But in Russian media, alternative explanations proliferated, each one more far-fetched than the next. Russian media claimed that Ukrainians shot down the plane. They claimed the CIA provided help. They asserted that the plane might have been mistaken for Vladimir Putin's, making it a target. They claimed bodies on the ground were planted there. At the time, the editor-in-chief of Russia 24 said this, as state TV, our mission is to support the interests of the state. Official opinions are determinative for our programs, for our channel. Now, state control and manipulation of television stations and newspapers is one thing, but the internet in Russia had long been largely uncensored. That is no longer the case. Early last year, Russian authorities were given the power to block websites without any official explanation. Almost immediately, 4 Russian opposition websites were blocked. By the summer of last year, speech on the internet was constrained even further. New rules required anyone with a daily online audience of more than 3,000 people to register with Russia's Internet Oversight Agency. Names and contact details were to be provided, and bloggers would be held liable for anything deemed misinformation, including in comments from members of the public. Late last year, a new Russian law required that data about Russian users be stored on computer servers within the country. That way, Russia would have easy access to information about the use of Facebook, Twitter, Google, and other services. The Russian government already had an arsenal of laws it could use against those speaking freely. The new rules created additional risks. Bloggers were more likely to muzzle themselves for fear of fines and criminal prosecution. Many of the rules are considered vague and confusing, but ambiguity is often a weapon in the hands of government, and that is the case in Russia today. As George Packer wrote in The New Yorker, in Russia, Vladimir Putin has been masterful at creating an atmosphere in which there are no clear rules, so that intellectuals and artists stifle themselves in order not to run afoul of vague laws and even vaguer social pressure. Now, until this point, I've only talked about official suppression of free speech and a free press. But the threats are broader, more menacing than that. Non-state actors can be an even greater danger. Two images last year cannot be forgotten. Those are the images of James Foley and Steve Sotloff, independent journalists executed by the Islamic State. Their fate made horrifyingly clear the risks that journalists now face and telling the world what they see. This year, Islamist terrorists slaughtered staffers at Charlie Hebdo, a Paris satirical weekly, in reaction to caricatures of Muhammad. And then there is what happens behind walls, unseen, deliberately hidden from public view. And I think now of the Washington Post correspondent in Tehran, Jason Rezaian, held in Iran's worst prison, suffering physically and emotionally for more than a year. He has been targeted with phony charges of espionage and other supposed offenses, for which there has been no evidence. And he has had to endure a sham trial where evidence and fairness and the basic principles of due process clearly do not matter. These are just the publicized incidents. The Committee to Protect Journalists notes that while most coverage of attacks against the press is focused on well-connected journalists, 9 of 10 killed are local reporters covering local stories. In the past 3 years, violence against journalists has soared to record levels. An average of more than 1 journalist is killed every week. In places like Mexico, reporting on drug cartels, crime syndicates, and corruption is a deadly business. In just the week of June 28th this year, 3 journalists were killed there. Rarely are killers found and prosecuted. In much of the world, rarely are they actively pursued. All of this imposes an obligation on journalists for news organizations in the United States, where, despite our own concerns, we enjoy freedoms unimagined in the rest of the world. We are able to write what our professional colleagues in other countries cannot. Their lives and those of their families would be at risk. Evan Osnos, longtime China correspondent for The New Yorker, put it well recently. So, in concluding, I will quote him. As correspondents who enjoy the freedom to write what we know, we have a responsibility to do it, not only for the sake of our readers, but for the sake of reporters who don't enjoy the same privileges. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Marty. That was wonderful. The next speaker is also a very distinguished journalist. Elisabeth Bumiller was born in Denmark, grew up in Cincinnati, Northwestern Columbia School of Journalism, and then went on to a long career as a journalist. She has been a reporter and a correspondent for the for the Washington Post, was in New Delhi, in Tokyo, joined the New York Times, I think it was in 1995, and she's had many different assignments there, covering the White House during the period after 9/11, also covering the Pentagon. She became the Washington editor of the New York Times in February of this year, where she organizes and directs coverage from maybe 30 or so reporters in the Washington Bureau of the Times. While doing all of this, she has also managed to write some books. In India, for example, she wrote the best-selling story about women having sons. The exact title of it escapes me now. I wrote it down. You can do it later. And then in Tokyo, she managed to write a book about family life in Japan while being the mother of a 4-year-old and an infant, and that was real juggling on her part. Her book about Condoleezza Rice, the biography, is available in the rear up here, and Elisabeth will be available to sign copies for sale by the Norwich bookstore during the break. So please join me in welcoming Elisabeth Bumiller of the New York Times.
Thank you, Tom. The title of my book, it's a long one, is May You Be the Mother of 100 Sons, A Journey Among the Women of India. It's an ironic title, obviously, because it's about the kind of values that are placed, the kind of expectations that are placed upon women in India. Anyway, thank you. It's wonderful to be here. It's a beautiful place to spend a day or two. It's great to share the stage with Marty, who, as he said, we first met at the Miami Herald. We crossed paths at the New York Times, not at the Washington Post, but you can see how small the sorority and fraternity is of journalists in this country, because we all know each other. Anyway, thank you. A little more than 30 years ago, can I read this without my glasses? I think I can. I arrived in the middle of the night in New Delhi with my husband to begin our first overseas assignment. I was then a reporter for the Washington Post, and my husband, Steve Wiseman, had just finished 5 years as a White House correspondent for the New York Times. I was 28 years old and had been no farther from the United States than Europe. I still remember, Tom will remember this, stepping out of the door of the plane. This was long before the completion of the modern Indira Gandhi International Airport, and being assaulted by the dense fog and the overpowering, smoky, sweet smell of burning cow dung fires that people used for cooking and to keep warm. At our house on Prithvi Raj Road, the best address I will ever have, I wrote my stories for the Washington Post on a manual typewriter, not even an IBM Selectric, and certainly not the computer I was used to, because of all the power failures. When I was done, I took my copy to the local Reuters office, where it was punched out on a teletype machine and sent back to Washington. There was no internet in those days, not even CNN. To find out what was going on, Steve and I would read the local Indian papers, the Times of India, the Express, and listen to the BBC's World Service. There was one television station back then in India, the government-run Doordarshan, which ran documentaries on fertilizer plants, and I assure you was completely unwatchable. The New York Times arrived from New York by mail, 10 days late, all rolled up. India in those days was not the economic powerhouse and force in Asia it is now. To a lot of people back in the United States, India was an afterthought, if they thought about it at all. And yet, there were a lot of American foreign newspaper correspondents covering it. The Times had a bureau, as did the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, the Los Angeles Times, the Baltimore Sun, the Philadelphia Inquirer, Time Magazine. AP and UPI were there too. We wrote about the new Prime Minister, Rajiv Gandhi, about politics, about culture, about poverty, about economics. Today in New Delhi, the situation is quite different. India has emerged as a major player on the world stage, a rival to China, and a bigger story than it ever was. And yet, Time Magazine, the Baltimore Sun, the Philadelphia Inquirer, and for much of the last few years, the Los Angeles Times, they're all gone. The larger picture, if you look at traditional newspapers and foreign policy coverage, is worse. In 2003, the American Journalism Review reported that 10 newspapers and one newspaper chain employ 307 full-time foreign correspondents. In 2010, the last time they did the survey, that number had fallen to 234 full-time correspondents. AJR also found that since 1998, 20 newspapers had cut their bureaus overseas entirely. Now, is this a grim situation? Not exactly. Not if you look more closely. True, international news coverage is now concentrated in the handful of big papers, the Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Post, and in many places still the LA Times. But the vast reach of the internet, the Times has 60 million unique visitors a month, and we have an online digital subscriber base now of close to 1 million, ensures that the foreign overseas coverage is seen by far more people than we ever imagined back in the 1980s. The Associated Press has grown to some 3,700 employees working in 116 countries, many of them local hires. Bloomberg News, which didn't exist when I was in India, has a global staff of more than 2,300 in 101 foreign bureaus and 72 countries. National Public Radio has also really grown and now has 17 overseas bureaus. The New York Times now has more overseas bureaus, 30, than it did when I was in India, and depending on how you count it, about 80 full-time correspondents covering the world. On top of that, there have been new entries to the scene, like Global Post, which James Foley worked for, and which pays freelancers around the world for coverage you don't always see in the mainstream media. In 2012, Global Post won a Peabody Award for its videos on Libya, Mexico's drug wars, and an epidemic of kidnapping in Shanghai. Then there's Vice, which is the hottest new entry on the scene. Every young person wants to work for Vice, which is the new online international news organization. Last month, they interviewed President Obama when he visited the prison in Oklahoma, and they take their video cameras to some of the world's most dangerous places. They've done highly praised reporting in Ukraine, and they have a 5-part series on ISIS, which they spent a lot of time in Iraq and Syria, very dangerous. BuzzFeed and the Huffington Post actually have also begun to do foreign coverage. So, to my mind, the reports of the death of foreign news coverage in this country are really exaggerated. It just comes in a different form, not in front of you in your daily newspaper as much, unless it's the Times or the Post, but available in depth and richness and endless quantity if you know where to look for it, which is on the internet. Now, let's look at these news organizations that do cover the world, specifically how they cover America's projection of power around the world, which is the topic I was asked to speak about, and whether that feeds a narrative of an America in decline. Now, I don't expect that you all did the reading because you'd be like college students anywhere, right? But anyway, it's okay if you didn't, I'm going to talk about it. But first on your list was Chapter 2 of my colleague David Sanger's book, Confront and Conceal: Obama's Secret Wars and Surprising Use of American Power. Chapter 2 is called Afghan Good Enough, and it's a very smart look at the tortured 3-month review process that Obama went through in late 2009 ahead of the Afghan surge to send 30,000 additional American troops to Afghanistan. He had already sent that March the first batch of 17,000 troops to Afghanistan shortly after he took office, and he was loath to escalate the war, but felt pressure from his military commanders. But the White House had come to the realization that the war was being lost. I think the title of David's chapter says it all, which is how Obama's Afghan policy came to be known inside the government as Afghan Good Enough. The administration would do just what it had to and no more. General Stanley McChrystal, who was then the top American commander in Afghanistan, had wanted far more troops, as many as 80,000, but Obama settled on less. There was no big projection of American power here, especially since Obama set the withdrawal date for American forces at the same time that he announced the surge in his speech at West Point. The idea was that the Afghans would be better trained by the United States in the meantime, and they would have to learn how to defend their country on their own. I had my own small part in the surge and saw firsthand that, in 2010, the potential and great limits of American power in the world. In the spring and fall of 2010, when I was still a Pentagon reporter, I embedded with a group of female Marines in Helmand Province in southern Afghanistan, which is a Taliban stronghold. Women were not allowed in combat in the Marines, but in an experiment that year, that skirted the regulations, the Marines sent small groups of women, no more than 2 or 3 at a time, out with all-male infantry foot patrols into remote and dangerous pockets of Helmand. Back then, the United States was still engaged in what was called the counterinsurgency strategy, that is, trying to win over the local population by protecting them, building schools and clinics and roads, meeting with village elders. The thought was that if you had some women on the ground, female Marines, they could engage with Afghan women, half of the population, which was, of course, off limits to American men, certainly American male Marines. So over 2 weeks in May that year and 2 weeks later in September, I was there with the Marines as we sat over endless cups of tea and also went on a lot of dangerous foot patrols and talked about what the Marines could do for various villages, a school, a well, a healthcare center, jobs. It was the ultimate projection of American soft power, and it was very well-meaning. I am certain, I know, that some Afghan women ended up with some very good feelings about the Marines, but it was a drop in the bucket. Bringing the population over to the side of the United States and the Afghan government was going to take a very, very, very long time, decades that Obama did not have. I next asked you to look at a chapter in my book about Condoleezza Rice called Hamas Won. This is what Condi Rice said after she noticed, while exercising on her elliptical trainer at 5 a.m. in January 2006, that the news crawl across the bottom of the television screen she was watching said, "In wake of Hamas victory, Palestinian cabinet resigns." This was not what they had expected. She decided the news had to be wrong, and so she just kept exercising. But the crawl continued and continued. Finally, she got off the machine and called the State Department. She recalled what happened next in an interview I had with her for my book. She said, "I asked the State Department, what happened to the Palestinian elections? And they said, oh, Hamas won." And I thought, oh my goodness, Hamas won? With that, she said she got back on her elliptical trainer. She said, "I thought I might as well finish exercising because it's going to be a really long day." And that, at least, was a prediction that was correct. The United States had pushed hard for the elections as a way for Mahmoud Abbas and the governing Fatah party to consolidate power, and as a symbol of the new stirrings of democracy the Bush administration promised in the Middle East. They had not expected the wrong party to win. A year later, when Rice found herself dealing with big problems created by Hamas in the Middle East, she talked again about that election and how it reflected a certain limitation of American power. "I think there are plenty of things that Fatah could have done to head off Hamas, but not every problem is amenable to a U.S. solution," she told me. That's one of the first things you have to realize. Not everything that goes wrong is America's fault. Which brings me to some of the New York Times stories I included in the bibliography. Eric Schmidt and Michael Gordon in April this year in a story about Saudi Arabia's airstrikes against rebels in Yemen, airstrikes that were killing hundreds of civilians. This showed the limitations, as the headline put it, of American strategy. In other words, the Obama administration has chosen to work with and help allies from West Africa to the Middle East, rather than putting large numbers of American troops on the ground in crises. Most Americans would say that's a very good idea, but when one of your allies, in this case Saudi Arabia, uses airstrikes as the cudgel, you don't have a lot of control over them. In the same way, look at Helene Cooper's story from March about how American strategy in Iraq increasingly relies on Iran. The lead in her story says it all. At a time when President Obama is under political pressure from congressional Republicans over negotiations to rein in Tehran's nuclear ambitions, a startling paradox has emerged. Mr. Obama is becoming increasingly dependent on Iranian fighters as he tries to contain ISIS in Iraq and Syria without committing American ground troops. As Vali Nasser, a former special advisor to President Obama, put it, the only way in which the Obama administration can credibly stick with its strategy is by implicitly assuming that the Iranians will carry most of the weight and win the battles on the ground. Now, I cite these examples. I know this has been a long series about whether or not American power is ascendant, America is in decline or ascendant around the world. I cite these examples not as evidence of an America in retreat, but as examples of the purpose of journalism. People have often asked me when I've talked about political reporting if I think the press is biased. I replied that the press does have a bias toward conflict and trouble. We focus on what's wrong, what needs fixing. That's our responsibility, our job, our imperative, to expose problems. This year alone, you've read in the New York Times about, I hope you have, about the exploitation of nail salon workers in New York, the lack of oversight of SEAL Team 6, the shocking lawlessness on the high seas. And I think our foreign policy coverage and overseas coverage is much the same. To be sure, we do write about the big successes. We ran a 6-column banner headline and multiple stories the day the Iran deal was announced in Vienna. But since then, of course, and it's including in page 1 of the New York Times today, we focused on the resistance the deal is meeting in Congress and how Obama is fighting hard to win Democrats, even Democrats to his side. But as Robert Kagan says in the last reading I gave to you, every failure of the United States to get its every failure of the United States to get its way in the world tends to reinforce the impression of a nation in decline. Arabs and Israelis refuse to make peace. ISIS is on the rise. China hacks into the Office of Personnel Management and exposes millions of personnel records of federal workers. But look at the numbers, if you did, that Kagan points out. The US is still the richest economy in the world and has unmatched military strength. I know this from covering the Pentagon. This year's Pentagon budget is, after all, $600 billion, more than that of all the other great powers combined. To be sure, China's economy is on the rise and could overtake the US economy in the next 2 decades. But the idea that we now have less power in the world has been around for decades. Look at the fear in the United States of a rising Soviet Union in the 1950s, at the American withdrawal from Vietnam in the 1970s, the rise of OPEC, the Iranian hostage crisis. In the late 1980s came the incredible economic boom in Japan, which was going to take over the world at the expense of the United States. Remember? I lived in Tokyo in those years, and I was there when President George H.W. Bush came over with 3 American automakers to try to convince the Japanese to buy American cars. Instead, he ended up getting sick in the lap of the Japanese prime minister. Terrible metaphor, as the Japanese made fun of our cars and informed me that Americans were actually lazy. That was our problem. We didn't work as hard as the Japanese. Naturally, every foreign correspondent in Tokyo got days and days of page 1 stories out of that disastrous trip. In conclusion, I think that the media, including the proliferation of new media, does a very, very good job of covering the day-to-day setbacks, crises, and conflicts that reflect the state of America's power overseas. Often it is dangerous, awe-inspiring work. Marty mentioned some of it. Look at from the Times. He's now at the New York. But look at Dexter Filkin, the work he did in Iraq. Chris Chivers, John Burns, great correspondents, all faced astonishing dangers. I think we do a less good job at the deeper stories that show long-term systemic change that indirectly reflects American values and American influence. But we do in fact do those stories. Look at how much coverage there has been of the improvement in the status of women over the last 25 years, particularly in Asia, something I wrote about. Look at the Pulitzer Prize-winning coverage of Ebola in Africa and the Obama administration's response to it. Some of those stories were written by Helene Cooper, who was part of the Pulitzer team this year. She went back to her native Liberia and did astonishing stories. And she's now the Pentagon correspondent for the Times. She has my old job. And Helene did I hope you read some of them, just very brave, courageous work in Liberia, but also had the stress of going back to her own country and having to see it through American eyes in a way. Look at our coverage of Kosovo in the late 1990s. I was there myself as well. Kosovo qualifies as a kind of an American success story. And honestly, look at the bigger picture. You can say that the rise of the Asian economies in the last 25 years means that America has a smaller relative piece of the economic pie. I'm sure this came up in previous lectures. Today, the US economy is 19% of the world economy compared to 25% 25 years ago. But the result of of the rise of the Asian economies and also in Latin America is that millions of people have been lifted out of poverty. It's not enough, of course, but it's a lot of people. And I don't see how that doesn't benefit the United States. And yet, it is a story you don't read about quite so often because it's actually harder to get a handle on and cover than the war that you might be right in the middle of. So, to really conclude, I think it's very important for us to step back and go beyond our imperative, the first chaotic draft of history, and put all the conflict and revolution in context in a way that reflects as much as it is possible in real time, which is what we work in, America's larger place in the world. Thank you.
I'll ask each one of them a question, and then there may be some questions that both of them can respond to. First one to Elisabeth. You have covered the White House. Is it true that the Obama administration is the most secretive administrations in recent history and the most manipulative of the press?
Well, I can tell you that our previous executive editor, Jill Abramson, said that it was the most secretive in history. So she said that. She's no longer with us, but that has nothing to do with it.
They got rid of her, huh?
But I do think there are special challenges in covering this White House.
There's a problem with the sound here.
Elizabeth,
so
they can't hear you back there.
Okay.
There's a bit of an echo.
How's this? Is that okay?
Okay, Todd, it's over to you. Anyway, what she said is that, yes, a guarded yes, and she quoted Jill Abramson, the former executive editor of the New York Times, as saying that about the Obama administration.
Is this any better now? Okay, it's all right.
Go ahead.
So I will say that the Obama administration presents a lot of challenges. Certainly, if you look at okay, is this better? Okay, so let's get rid of this thing. If you look at the NSA surveillance, that's certainly an example of that. If you look at the drone program, Obama, when he first came into office, increased the number of drone strikes way beyond what the Bush administration had done, but most of them were largely kept secret. They're done by the CIA. The drone strikes in Pakistan, Yemen, Somalia, none of those are made public. Now the drone strikes have gone down, but there's a great deal of secrecy surrounding the program. Same with recently, Mark Mazzetti and Mattapuza wrote a story about drone strikes and made the decision, actually it was the executive editor of Dean Baquet, made the decision to name the senior officers who were running the CIA drone program. There was a great deal of controversy and criticism of the Times for that, but Dean Baquet felt very strongly that since the Pentagon program is public and the officers who run it are public, that since this was a huge part of American power and foreign policy, that the officers should be named, and the CIA was very angry with this. But the point is that there is a great deal of secrecy in this administration. It's a challenge to cover. I think it's become, in terms of the White House reporters, we have 4 White House correspondents. They're fantastic. Peter Baker's the chief White House correspondent, but they will tell you how difficult it is. It's because of, which is sort of the problem I had too in the Bush administration. I've outlined the secrecy for you in one way, but the other problem is getting access to their thinking and the debate inside the White House about policy decisions. That is really hard to get at in real time. I used to have the problem of finally getting in to see somebody, and then you would just get talking points. You didn't have any, there was no real conversation about why they were debating certain points, and because they don't want to have you write it as conflict, right? But access to their thinking is really important. That's what's really hard to get. It's getting easier now in the last 18 months, the Obama administration, because like any administration, they're loosening up. They see the end in sight. The president himself is certainly been much more open about his thinking. But I guess that's a long way of answering to say, yes, there are serious challenges in covering any White House, and certainly this one.
Thanks. Marty, do you have any observations about that, or you want me to ask another?
No, I think Elizabeth covered it.
Okay.
Covered it well.
Here's a question for you, Marty. You have been an editor of many important newspapers and thus have a lot of experience with different owners and publishers. Can you give us some insight on what it's like to be the editor under Jeff Bezos, the head of Amazon, the new owner of the Washington Post?
Sure. Well, Jeff Bezos bought us over a year and a half ago, and he was an unusual buyer, obviously, for a news organization like ours, and it was wholly unexpected. Nobody knew he had any interest in our field, and nobody expected that the Graham family would sell the Washington Post, which it had owned for such a long period of time, and a revered family like that. It's actually been a good experience. It's been a good experience because Jeff, I think, brings to the Post some things that we need. He brings questions about the way we do things and a different way of thinking about it. It's certainly some hard questions about how we approach our work. Number two, he brings ideas for new things that we could do and an openness to our ideas, but also brings his own ideas. And we need fresh ideas in our field. We need some people from outside the industry who understand particularly technology and the way information is communicated and shared. And thirdly, and importantly, he brings capital. And he is one of the wealthiest people in the world, and he's been willing to invest. And that's been great because we're in a period where we have to make this transition from a print era to what is a digital era. We live in a digital society now. We live in a mobile society. And so we need to fund experiments, and he has been willing to fund all sorts of experiments for us, things that we can try and see if they work for a period of time. And he calls it providing a runway, sort of a period where we can try things before we actually take off. So we're not supposed to land, but only take off on this runway. No landings allowed. And so I think it's been a very good experience, and we have grown very rapidly. Among our peer set, we're growing more rapidly than anybody, and from that standpoint, it's been a really terrific experience.
Can you give a specific example of an experiment that has worked and one that has failed?
Well, I won't talk about failures, so especially since it's being televised and there are hundreds of people here. So, but I will talk about successes. We've had a couple. We've had a number of them actually. So we have an overnight crew. They produce something called Morning Mix. They work in the enviable hours of 10 o'clock at night till 6 o'clock in the morning, and they look all over the world, all over the internet for stories that can be done. They develop those stories in our own distinct way, and those stories get posted 5 o'clock in the morning or earlier, and it gives us a lot of fresh content in the morning, written in a way that's particularly suited to the web, which is different from the way you would write for a newspaper. It is its own medium, and that's been quite successful. We also started something called Post Everything, which is kind of our answer to what Huffington Post, I guess, was at the beginning, where we invite outside writers to write for us, and typically a lot of ordinary individuals who are writing about their own personal experiences. Those have been hugely popular pieces. They've done extremely well. Probably our most popular was one that they always have very good headlines, and the headline was, "What happened when I drove my Mercedes down to pick up my food stamps?" It's a very popular piece. People were of different minds about this individual, so, but it was widely shared.
Thanks. This is a question for both of you, starting with Elisabeth. How do you explain the success of Fox News? And related to that is, what is your opinion about the future of print journalism?
Elisabeth's going to get all the good questions here.
You have to take this one too. Well, I think Fox News appeals to a committed audience people who believe, who are the same. I'm on television here, so who believe in much of the Fox News point of view. It's not a surprise, you know, and it's lively, it's engaging, it has a very strong point of view, and I think it, you know, confirms to a lot of people's political beliefs who watch it. It's not a surprise. You know, CNN is doing something very different, which is trying to, you know, being a straight news organization. What was the rest of the question? Oh, the future of print journalism. Well, yes, okay. So for now, I can tell you that, I can talk about the Times and the future of print journalism. For now, we see a print New York Times coming out for the foreseeable future. I can't predict how many more years that would be or if it's ever going to go away, but it's certainly, right now, the print edition of the New York Times, the daily circulation is something less than 700,000. Our digital-only subscribers are close to 1 million now, so you can see what's happening. And that's the paywall. I mean, that's people are paying for those digital-only subscriptions. So, but right now, most of the revenue comes from print advertising. There's the increase in digital advertising and revenue, but it hasn't caught up yet with print. But right now, we're certainly still committed to the print newspaper, but a huge amount of focus, of course, is on the web, and especially on mobile, on phones, because that is where the readership is really, really going. So I think that, you know, as the senior editors at the Times like to say, we don't care how you get your news, how you get your New York Times every morning. We just, you know, you can get it any number of ways. We just want you still to get it. And right now and Marty can talk about this too, right now there's a huge push in the newsroom to get our stories out in front of people with all sorts of, you know, audience growth editors who push out our stories, and so getting the stories out in front of the right people. So I think there's a lot of energy, there's a lot of optimism in the newsroom right now. Print, I don't know. What do you think? I mean, no, you probably...
Marty?
Yeah.
Well, the future of journalism broadly, I think, is good. I think there are a lot of things that we can do now in terms of storytelling that we simply couldn't do before. First of all, we're reaching more people. We're reaching people all over the world, and they can get information instantaneously in a way that they could not before. We can provide original documents. We can provide video that they would want to see at that moment. You name it. There are a lot of things that we can do. It'll be challenging. It's economically challenging. There's no question. As far as print is concerned, I think that and I've said this publicly in speeches, that we have to move beyond the idea that print is going to be a big part of what we do for a very long time. It won't. I don't know exactly what the end date is, and it probably won't come to a hard end. There'll be some sort of print product, but I don't think it'll be a big part of what news organizations like ours do for a very long, for much longer. It is a digital world that we live in, whether you like it or not. And it's actually more than a digital world, it's a mobile world. So many people are getting their information off of smartphones. And a huge amount of our traffic at the New York Times as well, and just about every news organization, comes from mobile devices. And a huge portion of the traffic that's coming from mobile devices is coming not directly to us, but is coming via Facebook and other social media, but primarily Facebook. And so you have a huge younger audience, millennial audience in particular. They are reading their news via Facebook, getting a Facebook feed, and then linking out to a story that might come from the Post, might come from the New York Times, could come from any other news organization as well. It's a very different way of getting your news. And there's not an expectation now that people should go out and seek their news. There's an expectation that the news should find them. And that what they're interested in should somehow magically appear in front of them, and that we will know what they're interested in, or their friends will share it with them. But there's not an expectation that they should necessarily go to a destination, and there they will find the information that would be of interest to them.
Thanks. I wonder if I could follow up on that with a question related to the economics of it. Where's the revenue stream for that kind of journalism? I mean, if Facebook is the prime window, so to speak, where does the Washington Post get revenue from that kind of a business model?
Right. Well, I thought you were going to provide the answer to that. We're still looking, you know. I mean, obviously we get digital revenue, and there are two sources of digital revenue, just as there were two primary sources of digital revenue, just as there were two primary sources of print revenue, and that is advertising and subscriptions. And it's sort of the same model that we had before, oddly enough. The problem with the advertising side is that the rates are significantly lower than they were before. You know, we used to think that we were in a competitive news town if there were 2 or 3 newspapers, and we talked about it as a competitive news town. Well, now we're competing with everybody. We're competing with all sorts of sites. We compete with CNN, we compete with Fox, we compete with blogs, we compete with BuzzFeed, we compete with Huffington Post. And not only that, for advertising, we actually compete with Google, we compete with Facebook, we compete with Twitter, we compete with these behemoths. They're much larger than we are, those organizations. And so there's the rates, the amount of inventory online seems to be infinite. So the more page views you have, the more inventory you have, the lower the advertising rates typically. And so it's a hugely challenging environment for that. So we're all sort of struggling to figure out what is a sustainable economic model. For the Times, a very important factor is, as Elisabeth has mentioned, has been subscriptions. They have done better at it than anybody else. I have over 1 million subscriptions, and that's great. On the other hand, it's pretty much leveled out, I think, and so that's now a challenge for them, is how do you generate growth if your overall subscription revenues have sort of plateaued.
There's a push, as a result of that, there's a push for foreign subscriptions. And so there's a big push now. It's not finished, but it's a big push to see how many English speakers we can get overseas and just grow the international audience. There's also a Chinese language edition, which is, of course, there's issues with that. It's blocked in China, but there's a lot of experiments going on with translated versions and stuff. So there are a lot of English speakers all over the world, and the Times likes to think of them as potential readers and subscribers.
Yeah. Elisabeth, this is a question about the Times coverage of Hillary Clinton. In the Sunday edition, Margaret Sullivan, the public editor, took the Times to task for its coverage of the alleged criminal action by Hillary and the use of emails. And she said that the post that the blog that she posted on about this got more attention than anything she's ever written. Do you have any views about how the Times has covered Clinton on this issue of the emails?
Well, I don't, Marty, the Post ran a Hillary Clinton story this morning on email, so you might want to ask Marty this.
Come on, Marty.
We haven't had any criticism as far as I know.
I'm not going to go beyond what our executive editor.
I turned off my smartphone. I don't know of any criticism out there.
I'm not going to go beyond what our executive editor said about this in Margaret Sullivan's long column about this. Just that, this is a difficult question for me to answer with this large crowd. I just want to say that. The sourcing on that story, as Dean said, we had high-level sources across multiple layers of government, and they told us the wrong thing.
Yeah.
And they were still telling us the wrong thing the next morning.
Yeah.
So you could say, well, we should have held the story. Well, they would have told us the wrong thing the next morning. So, it's been a difficult thing for the Times. I think that we did break the story originally. Michael Schmidt broke the original story, and the Clinton administration, understandably, the Clinton campaign has pushed back very strongly. But I think that's all I want to say about it. And I think Marty could talk about their email story this morning, which broke some ground.
Yeah.
And I just want to say one more thing. Also, sometimes people before Margaret Sullivan is not, she's our public editor. She's not an editor at the New York Times. So although she is in the newsroom, she's an outside person who is hired to pass judgment on what the editors and reporters of the New York Times do. So it's not an internal criticism. She is an outside source. People sometimes get that confused, and understandably, if she criticizes the reporter, then it's out there. Well, even the reporter was criticized by the New York Times senior editors. Well, this is not the case with Margaret Sullivan. She is an outside person hired specifically to critique the Times every day, basically.
Yep, thank you. A couple of questions, Marty, for you relating to the Washington Post journalist who's still in Iran. First, should the United States pay ransom to free captured journalists? And should that issue have been much more of an explicit condition for the recently negotiated Iran nuclear treaty?
Right. Well, you know, I mean, we have, the administration hasn't been asked to pay ransom to release Jason Rezaian from this prison in Iran, so that's not really relevant to this situation. I mean, that issue has come up with respect to other hostages, whether they happen to be journalists or other people, and whether the families themselves should pay ransom, and whether the United States should prohibit the paying of ransom as it has done in the past. That policy has been loosened now. I'm not going to take a position on that, and in fact, I don't think I'm responsible for the news and features coverage of the Post, and so, you know, my job is to make sure that we approach things in an objective way. I don't take a position on all of the issues in front of people, and including on what should have been the terms of the nuclear deal that the administration arrived at. We just believe that Jason Rezaian should be released, that he should be released immediately, that he did absolutely nothing wrong. Whether it's part of a nuclear deal or not part of a nuclear deal, the reality is that he did not engage in espionage. There's no evidence that he engaged in espionage. There's no evidence that he committed any other offense, and there's absolutely no reason for him to have been arrested in the first place, and there's no reason for him to have been in an Iranian prison, the worst prison in Iran now, for a year. And that has nothing, I mean, that's sort of independent of the nuclear agreement.
Thanks. Okay, turning to this country, what, if any, threats do you two see to the freedom of journalism and reporting in the United States?
You know, I think the freedom of journalism and reporting, I don't, maybe I can, well, financial, you know, I mean, I think that the financial difficulties have hit a lot of medium-sized newspapers really hard. And they've cut way back on staff, certainly on overseas reporting, as I talked about. They've cut back on local coverage of State House reporting, all those, all the kind of stories you used to see about, you know, corruption in state houses and state legislators. I mean, there's less and less of that in the country. So I don't see any kind of repression unless, I mean, maybe Marty can come up with something, but I don't see any, you know, in Washington, it's the usual problem of, you know, background sources, you know, it's hard to name sources, you know, with national security reporting in particular. But I don't see any repression in this country in terms of the government or, I mean, you know, again, you get the White House, the Obama administration will, you know, strenuously object to some stories, but, you know, no one orders us to stop publishing.
Right. I mean, I think the concern in Washington is primarily around, and this is also at state government levels, and that is slow responses to Freedom of Information Act requests, non-responsive to Freedom of Information Act requests, documents when they're finally released that are heavily redacted, that you've waited years for, those kinds of things. The leak investigations that have taken place, in which the New York Times has been, you know, central to that, with Jim Risen, who faced threat of imprisonment for not disclosing his source. Those kinds of leak investigations and the persistence of that approach and the number of them has led a number of people in government to sort of feel that they just shouldn't speak to the press. They fear that they would become objects of suspicion because there's evidence that they communicated with a journalist. Why give a background briefing even if you're not disclosing classified information if at some point you think that particular reporter might get access to classified information, and then you would become an object of suspicion and be subject to an investigation, have to hire a lawyer, and have your entire career upended. So I think in Washington that is a serious concern. There are people who just simply respond and say, don't email me, and they send you off to the press they send you back an email and copy the press operation and say, don't email me, don't contact me ever again. Here's the press contact, and that's the end of it. Now, at other levels, I think, I think the issue of public records requests is serious at the state and local level as well. I think you're seeing a certain resistance, a strong resistance on the part of state and local governments to releasing information that they're required to under law. Now, I think the greatest threat to the press in the United States comes from the press itself, and that is sometimes just a lack of courage to publish things. And, people are concerned about being accused of bias, about what the impact might be on the financial circumstances of their organization at a time where we're financially challenged. That's something that we ourselves have to deal with, and that we have to be able to overcome any concerns of that and show the courage to publish what the facts are and what the public should know.
This is a question about in-depth coverage. Can in-depth coverage be provided best by a daily newspaper versus a weekly such as the London Economist?
No, I would speak for my own organization. I think the story that I mentioned in my talk, SEAL Team 6, the nail salon story, the 4-part series on, again, violence and lawlessness and the shocking events on the high seas, those were all 8, 9, 10, 11,000 words, and people read them on their smartphones, believe it or not. And I think that there is a real place for that kind of coverage in, what a daily newspaper, a daily media organization like the New York Times, because and in fact, those kind of stories run, there's much more available with them when you look on the web. So I don't think that we would all retreat from that, and the Times never has. Is completely committed to what we call long-form journalism. Multi-part series. Yeah. It's a huge amount of commitment, huge amount of resources of reporters and editors and travel and graphic designers. But no, Dean Baquet especially is very committed to that kind of journalism.
Marty?
I think Marty will say the same thing.
We too are very committed to that. I think you can find that kind of in-depth reporting in all of the major news organizations today. We've spent an enormous amount of resources understanding the refugee crisis, the waves of refugees that are heading and landing in Europe. We have looked in depth at ISIS and what it's all about, particularly its recruiting practices. We've been in the midst of a major series looking at why the internet is so vulnerable, how it became that way, how it's been that way since the very beginning. And that enormous expenditure of resources looking back at the history of the internet and the people who created it and whether they even thought about security. The answer is the only security they thought about was a nuclear bomb. They didn't think about any other kind of security to any great degree. And we've embarked on a major series, as I mentioned during my remarks, about the threats to free expression around the world. We have many others as well, but we do it all the time.
Does the Citizens United ruling support or impede freedom of expression for most Americans? Who wants to take a crack at that?
One of the issues with these questions is that I think I'll speak for Marty. You don't want to take a political. We don't want to voice opinions here. So, but I think obviously it is. But with the stories we ran over the weekend or last couple of days about the amount of money that is poured into these campaigns from a very small number of extremely rich people. This is not exactly what Fred Wertheimer, for one, had in mind many years ago with campaign finance reform. So I think that we're covering it really closely. But if you look at, you guys can tell us what you think about a handful of extremely rich individuals financing, being the main financiers of many of these campaigns, particularly the Republican campaigns. And Ted Cruz has how many? He's just a handful of people who are supporting that campaign. And what it has done, as you can see, partly it's what it's done, is created a field of 17 Republican candidates. Because if you get a lot of money from a handful of people, you're on that stage tomorrow night. So that's my answer.
I agree with Elisabeth that I don't really want to express a point of view on a Supreme Court decision. I think that's that's an opinion that ordinary people can come to a conclusion on their own without my counsel.
Okay, related to that is, what is your view about the Donald Trump phenomenon? And Frank Bruni in the New York Times on Sunday suggested that the media is largely to blame for this phenomenon, what he called the perversion, quote, the perversion of politics by vacuous stagecraft.
Well, you know, Frank, he's a columnist, so he has opinions. And so, look, I mean, can't imagine not covering Donald Trump right now. He's ahead in the polls. But I think I will tell you what you have read everywhere, which is that right now, Trump is certainly reaching into a very disaffected group, angry group of Americans who are tired of Washington, tired of program talking points from politicians. I find it amazing that in his income disclosures, he said he was richer than perhaps he is. That's unheard of in politics, that you want to have more money than people think you have more money than you do. He's breaking all the rules, but this is, look, it's really early. He hasn't been tested severely in a serious policy debate. We shall see. I mean, right now it's the sort of summer before the campaign, the real summer of the campaign, and but he does appeal to a certain part of the United States, and this Upshot this morning says it's a wide range of people. I've got to look at that more closely. Anyway, he's certainly made, I think, the Clinton campaign very happy. I think he's made the Jeb Bush campaign very happy.
Any views, Marty?
Well, on Frank's column, which I haven't read, but for a while now, I've been very tempted to start a hashtag on Twitter called Blame the Media. Hashtag Blame the Media, so every time we're blamed for some perceived problem, it must be the media's fault. Obviously, if we just went away, everything would be fine. So it gets to be a little silly, I think. I mean, as far as Trump is concerned, the only other lesson that I think we should draw from this is that we have to be very skeptical of political pundits early on, including people who specialize now, these data specialists who are looking at the campaigns and saying who's a serious candidate and who's not a serious candidate. And I've often maintained that, look, we don't decide who the candidates are. We shouldn't predict necessarily who's going to be a serious candidate. We should take them all seriously, and then the voters get to decide. And I think this is clear evidence that the pundits don't always know what they're talking about. They can't predict who's going to be the serious candidate. No one would have predicted. In fact, no one did predict, as far as I know. We haven't unearthed someone who predicted that Donald Trump would be the leader at this stage. And look what's happened.
Okay, this question relates to your comments, Marty, on, although Elisabeth could probably talk about this as well. How will the restrictions on freedom of expression outside the United States, how are they likely to affect America's influence and power, if at all?
Well, I mean, Marty can answer it in a bigger way, but obviously the problems that the Times is facing in China are quite real. The website's been blocked from most of the Chinese, although they get around it. And we've also had problems with getting correspondence into Beijing because of the Times' coverage. So that's a big problem, that the Chinese are, and also getting correspondence out. There's a policy of attrition against the New York Times correspondents in China. So it's a significant problem. I mean, China comes to mind right away. You want to go on? I mean, well, you mentioned, go ahead. It was your speech.
But this wasn't part of it. I mean, I think that the blocking of access to information, the United States has generally maintained that the free flow of information will accrue to its benefit. That people will see how other people are living, they will see how other societies function, that accurate information will make its way into the information ecosystem. And to the extent that countries can control their internets, block access, then that theory begins to fall apart, and these countries have even greater control over what their citizens see. And I think that should probably make it more difficult for the United States to sort of exercise its will in the world if people think that's a good thing for us to do. And I think it's just axiomatic that would be the case. Yeah. And then for American journalists that are operating in these countries, it's extremely difficult. It's become extremely difficult to do their jobs. They can be arrested, they can be harassed, they can be prohibited. The New York Times has not been able to receive visas for journalists to go into China for several of its journalists. It still has people who have existing visas in China who are there, but they've been denied visas because the Chinese government is upset over some very good reporting by the New York Times about corruption there, and that makes it. And that's true in other countries as well.
Yeah. There have been several questions about the fine line between reporting the news and shaping, so-called quote, shaping the news. When it comes to covering incidents relating to American power abroad, Fox News and MSNBC tell different stories. They seem to be trying to shape people's perceptions. Is this right?
Well, that's yeah, I mean, that's not, whether it's right or wrong, it's what they see as their audience. I mean, it's, MSNBC on the left and Fox on the right. And you can just see it from the pick of on MSNBC. You can see it through Rachel Maddow and so forth. Especially in the evening, all of the hosts who have a very liberal bent, and MSNBC has always felt that works for them, especially during political campaigns. I think there's now some. I mean, I can't speak for MSNBC, but I think there's some debate about whether they still want to do that. But it certainly works as you go into a political campaign. And to watch programs that reinforce your beliefs, that makes you feel good, and and then CNN is right in the middle, and sometimes it struggles with an audience, although it's doing much better now, because it presents itself as straight on reporting. But that's the calculation the senior people at both of those networks have made about appealing to a particular segment of the audience. Yeah. Whether it's right or wrong, it's what works for them.
Marty, anything?
Yeah, I'm not sure that they thought about whether it's right or wrong. I think they thought about whether it's their business model, and it is their business model, and they recognize that, as is the case, that many people, if not most people, are drawn to news organizations that affirm their pre-existing points of view, and so they feel more comfortable with it. They feel that their views are validated. And they believe that others are just wrong. And so it's not our business model for the two of us up here or the organizations that we represent. So that's not who we want to be, and we think people come to us for different reasons.
Yeah. Related to that is a question about prominent journalists that are invited to go onto talk shows. On one hand, that helps the brand, for the Washington Post and the New York Times. On the other hand, when you get into a broadcast where there's a lot of opinion being formed, do you have any ground rules at either of your newspapers about what you tell Dan Baltz, your political reporter, or someone like yourself, Elisabeth, going into these situations with George Will and all his opinions? How do you tread that line between reporting and opinion when your byline appears in these newspapers?
Well, I can, I used to go on television a lot when I was covering the White House, and now that I'm, inside the office all day, quite a bit less so. But I was, it was always, the rules are you don't express opinions and you don't predict. You don't say so-and-so is going to win or whatever. And you're also kind of boring. Sort of like today. You don't say, Marty and I have both said things that were taken out of, were taken and people ran with them, so you're very careful. But it is an issue. You're on those shows because of your supposed expertise, and so I would always answer the questions as, this is what my reporting has told me, and yes, on the one hand, the Democrats say this, but of course the Republicans say that. I was tried to be very measured, but it is an issue when you're on those shows, and you've got George Will and people who are opinion people expressing very strong views, and then you are sitting there in the middle of this fight, and you don't want to take sides, you can't take sides, but, so it is an issue, and sometimes, I would just think, no, I'm not going to do that. It's too hard, and I'm going to tell them no. So that's, but we have, Helene Cooper goes on Meet the Press all the time and is very careful, But you're never as fiery or as provocative or as interesting as the opinion people on those shows.
Marty?
Yeah, our approach is, just to keep it brief, our approach is the same. It's basically you can't say anything on those shows that you wouldn't say in the paper or on our website. Those are the standards. Those are the standards that we use, and those are the ones that we try to enforce. It's a difficult environment in which to operate. It can be like, locker room conversation, and so it gets tricky. There's a risk of getting carried away, but those are the ground rules.
Yeah. Okay. Just to flip this a bit, should the press be more biased by not giving equal time to climate change deniers, anti-evolutionists, etc.?
I want to answer that question because one of the people I edit is Coral Davenport, the great environmental writer, the new environmental writer. Not so new anymore, it's almost been at times 2 years. But, there's this, and Margaret Sullivan, our public editor, is big on this notion of false equivalency, that, to be an unbiased reporter, you have to say, on the one hand, there's been, the vast majority of scientists say that there's clearly climate change and it's caused by humans. On the other hand, these other people say, well, we don't know for sure and there's no real evidence. Well, we don't do that anymore on climate change. It's 99% or whatever, but we basically say, because of the established science or of human-caused climate change. So we don't do that. But other issues we do, but that's one where we've kind of moved beyond this, what I would call the false equivalency.
Yeah.
Well, we treat climate change as real and serious. That is where, as Elisabeth said, where the vast majority, the preponderance, even almost unanimous view, not quite unanimous, but almost unanimous view of scientists rests. And so we treat science seriously and respect it, and that's how we write about it. Now, occasionally, the op-ed page will run a piece from someone who has an alternative point of view, but that's their job, is to be open to all points of view.
Yeah. Should the internet be governed by global agreement among nations? And if yes, how can the United States inspire such a global agreement?
You're going to answer that one.
Sorry, what was that? What was that one again? I'm sorry, what was that?
Should the internet be governed by global agreement?
Oh, I see. Yeah, right. Okay. Well, there is a lot of discussion, I gather, about whether, as I said, whether this should be treated as a global commons and there should be standard rules of behavior for the internet, the way that we deal with space, the way that we deal with the high seas, things like that. And that would probably be, certainly be a better system than having authoritarian regimes close off the internet, have their own rules for each of these individual states, and where we already see what the consequences of that are. That's a brutal repression of free speech in those countries, and it denies citizens of those countries access to information that's available to millions and billions of people around the world. So. It's certainly better than a country-by-country intranet.
Yeah, yeah. 24-hour news channels, do they do more harm than good? Too polarizing?
Well, we were talked about MSNBC and Fox. I think they're repetitive. I mean, if you can't watch them for more than they go over, they chew over the same developments every day over and over and over again. So I don't think they're certainly not harmful at all.
Brain damage.
right. Yeah. So you could go berserk watching them for that long, but I think that, I don't think they're harmful. I mean, 1,000 flowers bloom and stuff. I just think they're they're really hard to watch, and especially sometimes, you know, CNN in the middle of the day is, breaking news. It's got a really shifting standard for breaking news, or, you know, developing now is really not a big, but we keep CNN on in the Washington Bureau and in the newsroom in New York, so we keep an eye on it, and you can sort of see as it ebbs and flows over the course of the day. If they find a plane part, it's a very big deal, and they do that for many hours. So anyway, it's like, oh, they found a plane part. They're going to be, you know, we don't have to watch for a while. So.
Okay, Marty, here's a question for you. As a percentage of gross budget, please compare the dollars expended on international news by the Washington Post in 2014 with a decade earlier.
And you must know exactly.
I'm sure I have that here somewhere.
Come on, McNamara.
No, I have no idea. I'm sure it's less. So we have about 30 people overseas in 15 bureaus. It's not as many as the New York Times, but it's substantial. We spend an enormous amount of money. Now that if I think about it, a decade ago, we were covering some wars. And so it was probably even substantially more expensive then, because to cover the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq was cost a fortune, and was a huge investment of resources of every type. So you know, it's less, but it's still substantial.
Okay, a question for both of you, and that relates to the coverage of the presidential election for 2016. The coverage of the Kennedy election in 1960 was revealed through Teddy White's book, The Making of a President, a classic, and another book on the boys in the bus about how the press handled that. I wonder, looking at back at that, would you both comment on how you see the coverage of this current election cycle from your two perspectives, and what are the challenges that the two newspapers face when they're dealing with this?
Well, I'm not responsible for the presidential campaign coverage, but I will answer the question. You look back at the boys, you look at Teddy White's book and the boys on the bus. First of all, the boys on the bus, that's changed, obviously. But it was, it's a hilarious book. But it was, the difference now, I was on the McCain campaign in 2008, and things have changed drastically even since '08. Now, first of all, there's girls on the bus, and there is just, back in, there's 1,000 things that are different, but back in those days, there was a lot of middle-aged guys covering these campaigns, and they would file one story a day at 5 or 6 o'clock at night. They would, I think they were filing on typewriters, and I guess, how did they file copy? They must have dictated by phone. They dictated, yeah. There was a dictation room at the New York Times and at the Washington Post, and you would just read your copy. I actually did that for early days of the Washington Post. You would read your copy to somebody who would take down dictation at the other end. That's how you got your stories in. But the main thing that was different was that there was one story a day and there was one deadline. And now these campaigns are brutal. It was going on with the McCain campaign in '08, but it's way worse now in terms of constantly filing, tweeting constantly, feeding the web, feeding First Draft, which is our political, it's our early morning newsletter, but it's also, we feed this all day long with items from the campaign. There's also 17 candidates. And so it's, I look at how these reporters work now, and again, you're filing all day long, you're tweeting, you're filing, you're posting, and then at the end of the day, you have to come up with, after all of this, an intelligent, thoughtful New York Times story for the later editions of for the web and for the later editions of the paper. It's 24 hours. It kind of never stops. And it was getting to me on the McCain campaign, but it's really bad now. It's very hard, I think, to have. It's hard to find time to think, I think, in this kind of a process, and to step back and to write bigger stories about what it all means. The reporters do it; they're quite good at it, but the demands on them are way beyond what it ever was on the boys on the bus.
I actually kind of like the direction of some of the reporting, not the kind of day-to-day reporting, minute-by-minute reporting that we all have to do now, which we did not have to do in the past. And by the way, the Times had a dictation room where they had a whole staff of people taking dictation. They were the last to eliminate it. But I find that news organizations like ours have decided that a lot of our resources shouldn't be dedicated to just following the candidates as they move around, but that we should stand back and just pursue the kinds of stories that we think ought to be pursued. So there's a lot more investigative reporting, I think, that goes on. These candidates are much more aggressively vetted, I think, than they were in the past. We've looked at, we go deep into their backgrounds, we go deep into their financial connections, we go deep into their donors in a way that we should. And I think we do a lot what we call enterprise reporting. It's where it's not just the daily reporting, we're actually being enterprising about it and finding deeper stories that require more time and that actually break news when they come out. Not news that the candidate happened to say this, or there was this malapropism on the part of this candidate, or whatever it might be, but actually much deeper stories than we've had in the past, and I'm pleased with that coverage.
There were a couple of questions about radio. Is radio still strong, vital, and global? There used to be a Voice of America which reported America's stories and values abroad. Does this exist anymore?
Well, yes. NPR, as I mentioned, is bigger than ever and has a much stronger presence overseas. It's also very big here in the United States. I'm sure many of you listen to NPR. Voice of America has had its ups and downs. It's under constant debate in Congress about what its mission should be. Obviously, the Voice of America journalists want to keep it as a completely separate, objective news organization, and there's a move in Congress to make it more, as the United States is coming under siege from all this ISIS propaganda, there's a move in Congress to try and make it more reflective of American values and American foreign policy. There's obviously the journalists at VOA are totally opposed to that. But I think NPR is a really strong presence here and overseas, and has continued to grow and to flourish.
No.
NPR is huge. NPR is a very large organization. They have a bit of a difficult relationship with all their affiliates around the country about who should be covering what and how big NPR itself should become, which some affiliates feel may be at their expense. So they're really working through that situation right now. But they are a very substantial news organization. But I would point out that they're very dependent on other news organizations like ours. So if you listen to NPR, and looking out here, my guess is there are a large number of you do listen to NPR, you will hear as their guests regularly reporters from the Washington Post, reporters from the New York Times, reporters from the Wall Street Journal, reporters from the Boston Globe, reporters from here. And they're very dependent on the actual original reporting that is done by other news organizations. As large as they are, they don't have a staff that's as substantial as ours to do the kind of original reporting that we do. Not to minimize what they do very good work, and they do a fair amount of original reporting as well. But to fill their hours of programming, they're highly dependent on others, and we're part of that. We're part of that ecosystem.
Yeah. This question relates to Elisabeth's comment about the Baltimore Sun closing its foreign bureau, and a few other newspapers doing the same. And the question relates to what they call second-tier newspapers, and not the Post and the Times or the Wall Street Journal. Do you have any views about the future of these newspapers? I mean, Chicago, Milwaukee Journal, these kinds of things. What?
Well, they're like all newspapers, including the New York Times. They're struggling with their print editions and trying to get digital editions up and and profitable. But they've been hit harder, I think, and they have cut back their newsrooms quite a bit. The Times has the advantage because of its size and its reach around the country. So I think they're moving along. Look at my hometown paper, the Cincinnati Enquirer, is, when I was growing up, we had two. We had the Cincinnati Enquirer and the Cincinnati Post, and They were big and fat, and you go out now and the end of the driveway, and it's like a little tiny. The Cincinnati Enquirer is a little tiny tabloid with. It looks like an advertiser, So I mean, they've all shrunk. I don't know what their future is. There's what has changed locally, and I don't know about this in that great detail, but there have been a lot of local websites that have really sprung up and are sort of hyper local coverage of these cities around the country. But I don't, what paper was it? I was at a Pointer seminar this past fall, and one of the people who was there was from a paper that reporters were doing self-editing. They had no editing staff. And I thought, oh my God.
Yeah.
But that's what's happening at some of these places. As they cut staff, reporters are editing themselves.
Yeah.
I can't, as a former reporter, I can't imagine that. As an editor, I can't imagine it either.
Yeah.
So
That
anyway.
leads into another question that
Yeah.
someone had about the vetting. I mean, traditional newspapers like the Times and the Post have good sub-editors to check the facts and whatnot. The question had to be, is there any vetting on the web on some of these news outlets that people read these days online that you know about?
Well, I mean, it depends. I mean, talking about the web is a very big space. I mean, there are a lot of different people on the web, and different people have different policies. We have a stated policy of trying to read everything, have at least one other person read something before it's posted, and I'm sure the Times has something very similar. Things happen at such a speed that I'm not sure that it's certainly not reviewed as closely as it was in the past, because we have to move things very, very quickly, and you do not get the same level of editing that you had in the past when it was a once-a-day newspaper or twice-a-day newspaper. Now we're talking about things being posted 24 hours a day, I mean, and including at night, all the time, 7 days a week. And if you're not the first with the story, there's a good chance that you're not going to get the traffic.
I mean, for our web editing, like the question is about writing for the web and posting it online, and then later it appears in print. We have a system, I'm sure the Post is the same, where we have 2 to 3 editors look at it before it goes up. There's the Times we call a backfield editor, which is somebody who looks at it for substance and, is a lead okay, and this is, then there's a copy editor who looks at it, and then there might be another editor who, if it's a really important story. But there's a lot of pressure to get things up quickly, and huge amounts of pressure. So, you have this constant tension between, we got to get this up, but we got to make sure it's right. And it can be nerve-wracking. I mean, what we do now in Washington sometimes is we have, if it's a really big deal story and it's got to go up right away, but it's very competitive, we will have 2 editors read it sort of simultaneously over. You can have another editor read over a shoulder, but it's still, again, and then the stories, the later versions of that story, as the day unfolds, as developments happen, the story can change a lot, and there's much more scrutiny given to that story at the end of the day, as we're about to post it for the last time as it goes into print.
Yeah.
Tom, can I go back to the previous question you asked about regional papers, if I might, because much of my career was involved with regional papers.
Sure.
I was editor of the Boston Globe for 11 and a half years and editor of the Miami Herald for a year and a half, and worked at the LA Times, so feel very strongly and very strongly committed to the success of those institutions. They do face enormous pressures. I'll own up to the fact that I eliminated the foreign coverage of the Boston Globe in, I guess it was 2007 or so, when we were going through the Great Recession. We were experiencing 30% decline in revenues, and as anybody in a management role has to do, you have to make some very tough decisions. And the question was, are we going to maintain our foreign staff, which was about 5 or 6 people, or are we going to cover our local region? And the answer for an institution like the Boston Globe was, we're going to cover our local region. Mm-hmm. And we can't give that up. That is our source of greatest value for our readers, and there are other places that can cover the world. Nobody was happy with that. I wasn't happy with that. We were sharply criticized. Pretty much almost all of the people who were overseas at that moment have since left the Boston Globe to do other things. You know, I think that those institutions, there are still many good newspapers out there. The Boston Globe still does a terrific job. The LA Times does a great job on a lot of subjects. There are some online operations. The Texas Tribune in Texas does a tremendous job, I think, of covering the state. And it's critically important that they succeed. So at the Boston Globe, you know, we launched the investigation of the Catholic Church when I was there that exposed the sex abuse scandal that the church is dealing with even today.
You got a Pulitzer for it.
We got a Pulitzer for that. And if we had not done that, that story would not have been done.
Yes.
And you know, I think these newspapers have to be the eyes and ears for the public. They have to. We cannot be everywhere, regardless of our size. Even if we were double the size, we would not be able to do that. And we learn a lot by looking at regional newspapers and local newspapers all around the country. And I think it's absolutely critical that they succeed. Their financial challenges are greater than ours. There's no question about it. We have the capacity to create national products, you know, or international products, as Elisabeth was talking about before, about how the New York Times is trying to get international subscribers. For regional newspapers, it's much more challenging, and they face the same competition from Google, which sells local advertising, or Facebook that sells local advertising. So, you know, I just think that they, notwithstanding the challenges that they face, they just do tremendous work under very difficult circumstances, and very often break very important stories that all of us learn from.
Yeah. Well said. Thank you. I'm going to ask one more question before we close. We're getting to the end. Before I do, I just want to ask both of you if there's something that you thought was going to be asked and it wasn't, or should have been. Okay. The final question has to do with the future. I wonder if you both could talk about the recruiting of young journalists in the digital age. What are you looking for? How excited are young people about doing the kind of things that you do that are so essential for American democracy?
I got to tell you, you know, it's given how tough the business is right now, we still get just amazing applicants of kids. I mean, we had this fantastic intern this summer in the Times Washington Bureau, who he's 22 years old. He graduated from Harvard. He just wants to be a journalist. He doesn't want to go into Wall Street or finance. You know, he wants to be a journalist, and he's a great writer. And the interesting thing, you think, okay, everybody. What I find about the young people we do hire, you know, first of all, we hire journalists. We don't hire just, you know, the main thing is you hire journalists, and some of them have more experience than others. Some of them have more potential. But what I find is interesting is that in all the emphasis we have on the web now and the iPhone and audience development and graphics and video. And that's really cool. And there's all these young people running around the newsroom now, you know, pushing our stories out to everybody. And they're young and they're hip. So many of them just want to be reporters and write stories. And that's what gives me a lot of hope. I mean, I thought, well, you're so cool. And, you know, we're sort of this legacy media. And, you know, we're all these old content providers, right? They just want to be New York Times reporters and write stories. Right. And it's great. Yeah. You know, that is their dream, you know, just to do the old-fashioned going out and interviewing people and writing a story, you know. So I have, there's still enormous interest. We get huge applicants, a number of applicants, so I have a lot of, you know, hope for the future.
I would say the single most encouraging thing in our profession today is the caliber of talent entering the profession. And the single most important thing to our profession is the talent that's in our profession. I'm amazed at the quality of people we have. The interns that we have in the summer, the people we end up hiring, some of them whom have just worked for several years or 5 years, something like that. It's amazing. They have multiple degrees. They speak many different languages. A lot more than we did. They're a lot smarter than I was or am. They're good writers. They're curious about the world. And they enter the profession for all the right reasons. They're not looking for fame. They're not looking for to be a celebrity. They think that we serve a very useful purpose in this society and in the world, and they want to be a part of it. And they do that knowing that the profession is at a very challenging moment. It faces all sorts of risks, and they do it anyway. All of us entered the profession when it was doing pretty much just fine. Whatever problems existed at the time, they paled by comparison with what we face today. So I have huge admiration for the people who are entering our profession now, and I'm very grateful that they've chosen journalism as the place for themselves.
Bravo. Thank you very much. Great. You were great. Thanks. Thanks a lot.